You are listening to Within Tolerance, a podcast for machinists by a machinist. I'm your host, Dylan Jackson from Proteum Machining, and this week I am so happy to welcome back Josh Hacko. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And so, for anybody who wants Josh's whole backstory, head on back. It was all the way back. I was surprised in episode 85 that you were last on. I could not believe it was that long ago. It felt like, fairly recent. But for anybody who doesn't know who you are, give us a 30-second rundown of, who you are and what you do.
Well, my name is Josh Hacko, and my official role, as pretentious as it sounds, is the technical director of Nicholas Hacko Watchmaker and NH Micro. But in reality, I'm just the guy that's running the machines and posting stuff on social media on both of those companies, and I guess making high precision parts in Australia.
Wonderful. And then if people want to follow along, where can they find you online?
Well, we do a lot of the watchmaking stuff on Instagram on the account Nicholas Hacko Watch, and we show what we're working on there, what current models we're releasing, and things like that. And then all the high precision job shop stuff is posted on NH Micro, and I'm a LinkedIn deviant. I love me some LinkedIn. So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn and see my all the classic LinkedIn posts, I'll be happy to accept your follow there too.
I think that's somewhere that I need to get better. I know I've talked to a few. We've had a few meetings with like marketing professionals and stuff, and like all of them are shocked. They're like, "Whoa, wait, you're not on LinkedIn more?" I'm like, I guess I'm technically on there, but no, the company doesn't have a page, and like we don't actively post or anything.
Yeah, LinkedIn is an interesting one because it's everything seems like a joke or a meme, or well, if you zoom out, I guess, and it's it it's acceptable because it works. Like those marketing professionals are probably telling you like you should consider it because buyers are on there, and people who might not even be buyers but know buyers are on there, and so they sort of share. And the best analogy I've seen is like it's Facebook for professionals, and your target market there is like so niche and specific that it one post with 5 likes is great because it's 5 people that like are so targeted. So yeah, I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Well, actually, this might be a perfect time to bring up Alex Kern's question of how much would you say social media has impacted your business? Has it brought clients, candidates, etc.? Has there been any negative effects?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, the first benefit that comes to mind with social media is the friendships that you form. And they might not impact your bottom line on your business directly. Like you might not get work from friendships, but there's far more that you gain from the friendships that you form on social media. So, there's hundreds of people that I consider friends that I've all met on social media, and it's quite interesting because in Australia, especially, the pool of like-minded people is very small when it comes to machining, and even high precision machining, or even advanced machining where you're involving automation and all those sorts of things. So for someone on the other side of the world to be able to communicate and interact with all these high-class machinists all over the world, it's a massive honor. So people like Alex, who's asked the question, who they're at the top of their game. And for me to have access to that, to be on via social media, just to be able to pip him a question and ask him, hey, what tools did you use for this? Or what was your approach for that? Or how would you approach this job? And for him to be able to respond in total openness is amazing. So that's like this abstract, indirect, massive benefit from social media. But I guess, harking back, LinkedIn has brought in quite a bit of work, and maybe not 100% directly. Like you wouldn't get an RFQ in your LinkedIn inbox, but there's so many relationships that have been formed with clients on the NH Micro side that wouldn't have existed without LinkedIn. Instagram can be a bit of a high like noise to signal ratio. There's a lot of sort of crud that happens on Instagram where, you know, you might just get
Yeah.
these DMs like, how much for this? It's like, well, I'm not really gonna.
Yeah, our website is in our bio.
Yeah.
You can head over there and figure it out.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's my only comment on Instagram. But outside of that, I would say that that's far outweighed by the sort of indirect benefits that you get from Instagram.
totally. Yeah. No, I find that it seems like very recently I spend much more time in stories or just in direct messages than I do actually. Like if I'm scrolling Instagram, it's like not, it is just mindless, you know, doom scrolling. It's not because I'm trying
Yes.
to like learn something, but like, you know, like you said, the friendships I've found through Instagram have been it's the reason I'm still on Instagram
Yes, and the
for sure.
stories are powerful because uh, it's a lot more comfortable to share something that disappears 24 hours later. And I find that the interactions that you get in the DMs and, you know, the conversations that start from the stories are far more meaningful as well than just comments on a post.
Totally. Yeah, I completely agree. So I want to get back to before we get into the rest of the questions. A lot has happened since the last time you were on. So I believe you had just gotten married the last time you were
Hmm.
on, and you were anxiously, or maybe had just placed your order for your Kern, your second Kern.
I'm not sure of the timeline. I think maybe
Maybe it was on its way already,
on its way. Yeah,
something like that.
maybe. Yeah.
So let's talk about it because I don't think you even had NH Micro as a
No.
company really. So let's go. You know what's happened in the last. I guess it's been what, a year and a half.
Hmm. Yeah, a lot has happened. Wow, where to start? Well, I guess on the watchmaking side, um, when we talked, I think we'd just started working on the NH3, but hadn't released anything.
Yeah.
And we were sort of plugging away at that. So the NH3 was a huge success for us in the sense that it was probably the first watch that we did in what we call like serial production. We did 25 of the same watch. And that was a big thing for us because it taught us. Well, that's not quite true. I guess the NH1 we did the exact same thing, but the bill of materials that we were making on the NH3 was much larger. So it was a not quite an apples to apples comparison. So with the NH3, we're making the dial and hands as well as I guess elements of the movement. Um, and so this was a huge bill of materials, and navigating our way through making 25 of that watch was a huge learning lesson, and it set us up for success in the next series and the next series after that by just the things we've learned from it. It also helped, I guess, on a design side. It started opening our mind of like different avenues that we can go down, and we were using different techniques to make different interesting visual patterns on the watch. And so that naturally led into what we're working on now, which is the Mark II, and we're calling it sort of the Mark II Girl. And that watch was in many ways a natural progression from the NH3 in a design philosophy sense. So we refined the design, but it was also a step up in terms of production. We made 50 of that watch, and making 50 of something involves, or at least presents a few more challenges. How do you get consistency in sort of slightly more arbitrary things like anodizing and color generation over 50 parts rather than 25? And that taught us a lot as well. And the plan there is to sort of not just have 50, but to have 50 in stock, so we can grow the company in that direction, and not have like 6 to 9 month lead times on a product that people want now.
Right.
So that was sort of what's happened in the last I guess year and a half with the watchmaking side. But what what we found was very shortly after we recorded last podcast, we found that we were getting pulled in two directions. So even under Nicholas Hacko Watch, we were doing a fair bit of work for external sort of third parties, in the sort of high precision contract manufacturing space. And a lot of that was prototyping and a very small amount of serial production for like single components and assemblies. But that was growing at a rate where it couldn't be ignored and it couldn't be sort of set aside. So we formally split off a business and established NH Micro, which is dedicated towards catering to those sorts of customers and providing clear communication to our clients that we're not really a watchmaker making your parts. We're a workshop that's specialized in making high precision components, and your parts might fit into that category. And that was a huge roller coaster, all positive and a massive learning experience as well. But NH Micro started sort of July, August 2021, I believe. And it's a bit over 18 months later, and I'm extremely happy with how everything's gone. And we've picked up so many interesting projects to work on and customers that we've I guess interfaced with. It's been a mad ride.
Yeah, you guys have been killing it. It's so cool to see. Clearly the need was there because, like, you opened and it seemed like immediately we're just slammed with work.
There was a bit of that, yeah. As soon as we told our existing clients that, I think about 20% of our revenue was generated from external work pre NH Micro. And when we told that 20% that, hey, we're doing this seriously, it almost seemed like every single client had another project they were waiting to give us. And they're like, oh, you got capacity, here you go. And it was just instantly swamped, or at least in the first 3 months, instantly swamped. And one of the biggest things that we took away from that whole experience was we were a little bit naive, thinking that we were well enough equipped to handle that sort of growth, and we weren't. And one of the biggest areas that sort of got highlighted, that like as a pain point in the critical chain, was the fact that we didn't have any redundancy in our milling machines. And so, I don't know, like 80 to 90% of our work is milling. And so we said, well, we need another milling machine that can handle this sort of work. And we scouted the market and we placed an order for a Kern Micro HD, which was really exciting. That was like the highlight of that whole year. I think we placed that order sort of early 2021, and it arrived January, February 2022. And it's been about, just under a year of running that machine.
That's awesome. That is it. It's so cool to see from the outside, like you guys growing so much, and you already had a current, like you were the first. Saunders's tour of your shop was the first time I had ever heard the word Kern, and so for then you guys to get like an HD, it was just very, very cool to see.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that, and thank you for watching along. It seems like it's I'm watching along too. So, that's what it feels like.
Well, we got a lot of questions about watch stuff and NH Micro and all that stuff. So let's get into it. Steel Phil asked, he wants to know what your CAM workflow looks like and what strategies have been the most effective for scaling production of NH Micro and the fussy tolerances that you're known for.
That's a good question. And I've got a sort of shameful answer, which is we don't really have an established standard operating procedure workflow. There's no document that outlines everything. And Phil actually has been one of the biggest mentors in Fusion and like Fusion hygiene of how to, efficiently and cleanly program things. So I feel like this is a trick question coming from him. I think he's probing to see if I've taken his advice.
Phil is a wizard for sure.
Yeah, is an absolute wizard.
But that was a big transition opening NH Micro, because you guys were not a Fusion shop up until that point, and then you were kind of dissatisfied, if I remember right, with what you were using.
Yeah, it was we were using Mastercam before, and Mastercam's great for some things, and we still use it. Although we had like the 2.5D suite, so that was sort of the entry level 2.5D suite, and that means no 3D milling. I think we had Flow as one toolpath. That was it, and so we could maybe 3D machine a chamfer. But the more NH micro work we got, and even within watchmaking, on the watchmaking side, it demanded obviously 3D machining, and multi-axis work became more and more prevalent. And you could do multi-axis work in Mastercam 2.5D by changing your like WCS all the time, but it was so clunky and honestly quite risky. Like it'd be very, very easy to crash the machine. So at one point, I sort of asked Phil, or I think Phil was always on my back saying, "Hey, you should do fusion. You should do fusion." It's slightly cult-like, but I appreciate that. And we just jumped in, and I was quite hesitant at the start because we had so many legacy programs in Mastercam and legacy workflows in Mastercam. But within, I want to say, like 2 months, we'd gone to like 50% fusion. And then within 6 months, we were 100% fusion for milling. And now the only thing we really use Mastercam for is like some like wire EDM. We still do that in Mastercam, but then most of like the scribing stuff we do is wireframe generated, and you can do that in Fusion, but for whatever reason, it's very slow. The sketches that we create seem to just lag out the Fusion project, whereas in Mastercam, it's like you're not even drawing anything. The wireframe there is very efficient. So the workflow for us, one big benefit that Fusion's given us in terms of workflow is like the file management system on the cloud. People hate the cloud, and I do see some drawbacks with it, but I think it's far outweighed by the positives. I can take my laptop, and all my files and all my data is there in that file manager, and we don't do any defense work, so it's not a consideration for that sort of thing. And every time I've asked if the NDAs get a bit serious, I say, hey, are you okay with us using Fusion's cloud data? And if every customer said, yeah, no problem, just don't share their prints. And I'm like, yeah, well, I was never going to do that, but the
Right,
cloud,
exactly.
yeah, just might as well ask.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other thing that's been really great with Fusion is like a templated workflow. That existed in Mastercam, but not to the level of of what Fusion can offer. The solid aware toolpaths, like your 3D adaptive, heck, even a 2D adaptive, and then the more advanced toolpaths like flat. Having them just selected with all the tools and all the parameters ready to go, and you just drag your part and you just start clicking straight away. Man, that's quite revolutionary coming from a system with based on Mastercam.
Totally. Yeah. So you are using like the container method of having,
Yes.
an empty component and then bringing stuff in.
Yes. It's sort of grouped by fixture or like fixture type. So I'd say the two main fixture types we use are like machining from round bar in an ER collet. A lot of the parts that we make can sort of fit into a 20 millimeter round bar. And so it's like a wannabe Williman in that sense.
Right. Definitely a benefit of making all those micro parts.
Yes. And you don't have to hold onto something that's itty bitty. And, having a templated sort of container workflow for that is amazing because all your files just get dragged into a project that's ready to go. And the second sort of fixturing method we really rely on is like a glue chuck type fixturing method. And like the glue chuck preparation is all saved there, and it's not quite part dependent, but it can be. And having that sort of semi-automated is perfect. Yeah.
So with that round bar, are you just having it off then and pulling off individual pieces and then sliding the stock up?
There's a couple of ways. That is definitely one way. I'm slightly hesitant to run like larger like slitting saws and things like that in the Kern machines. Not that they couldn't handle it; they could absolutely handle it. It's just a workflow I'm not yet comfortable with. So often, what happens is we get the round bar, you make the part, it's hanging on quite solidly, so we don't tab very much off. Then we take it to our manual lathe and just part off all the excess, like sort of the remnant that you're holding onto. And often there's a second op. So it's usually quite simple because you try to get everything done in that first op. But, there's been some parts where conveniently you have like two flats you can grip onto in a vise, and then maybe surface grind the backside or machine the backside and like drill a hole and you're done. And so you still have two ops, but like 90% of the work is done in the first op, and all the critical tolerances are hit in that first op. So your risk level is very low. Like you don't have to match two tolerances up in that second op, or at least you try to push to that way. And then yes, there have been lots of parts where we'll sort of tip the B axis over 90 degrees and use like a slightly skinny end mill, like a 1 mil or a 2 mil end mill, and pretty much part off like you would on a lathe and leave a little pip, and then you can just take that part out by hand and either index up or put a new piece of round bar that you've cut from the saw.
Gotcha. That sounds like, quite the dream for some parts.
Yeah.
Mickey Jacobs asked, first, when are we opening the NH Micro US branch? But more seriously, did you have any sort of quality management system when you were just focusing on watches? And then now that you're working on, space and greater manufacturing, have you had to ditch any old habits and embrace, ISO or anything like that?
It's a good question. With the watchmaking stuff, we had just internal quality demands and requirements. So some parts, the quality inspection route was quite slim, and you relied on I guess like gauging within the assembly, which is terrible. But because you're making the rest of the assembly, you don't really care, and the parts are sort of loose enough in tolerance that works fine. And that feedback loop is really quick, so that's a huge benefit of that. You might have like a semi-assembled watch next to the bench next to the machine, and then as soon as the part comes out, you clean it, you put it into the assembly, and you have an instant QC of whether that part will be good or not, to a very high level of certainty as well, because that's the exact assembly it's going into. So yes, you can use the pin gauges to measure the bores and put it out of the key ends and all those sorts of things, and we still do that. That's all part of it. But having a one-to-one workflow helped a lot with many parts in the watchmaking area. Now you can't really do that in the NH Micro side, and that's where the workflow hygiene starts mattering more and more, and you have to rely on your tools. So we use a Keyence IM system for a lot of the measurement that comes off these machines. Any sort of flat part with holes in it, perfect. And beyond that, there's a lot of like surface plate work and profile projector work upstairs in our little office area. So that became a slight change towards the NH Micro side. And I guess, yeah, maybe I should take one step back and caveat a few things. We did, of course, measure all of our watch parts. It's not like they just plopped into an assembly and we're ready to go. But the one thing we took from that is early on in the NH Micro sort of startup sequence, we told our customers, and I feel if I had my time again, I probably wouldn't do this, but we told our customers that we could help on the slightly more engineering side, like the DFM side, and analyze their tolerances and see if we can help in that sense and figure out ways of gauging, ways of QCing that actually help them, not just putting a standard plus or minus 10 micron tolerance on the entire assembly and then complaining about the price. And that consultancy side of the business was like really interesting. It was something I liked doing, but in retrospect, I think it caused a lot of problems. and like nothing big. There was no big problems, but it meant that you had a lot of liability, and sometimes you ended up becoming a teacher more than a consultant. And these engineers would be like, "But why?" And you're like, "Well, if I told you, but why? Like, it's another hour of consulting time. Are you okay with that?" It's like, "No, no, no, no. You just tell me why now."
Right.
So, but the one, yeah, the whole reason why I said that is that the one thing that brought was a deeper insight into these customers' assemblies, so that even though now we've sort of stepped back from that consulting and we don't really offer it, it does help try to instantly see if a one sentence suggestion can make a difference in the project, in how it's QC'd, or how it's and so this is like the most anti ISO thing I've ever heard. Like, no, like it shouldn't be like this, and we don't have ISO accreditation. But many of the customers do end up appreciating that, because it can save them a little bit of time, a little bit of money, and also simplify like the headaches of over tolerancing things.
Yeah, totally. No, I find the same thing with my customers, that my favorite customers are the ones that it feels like a collaboration. Like they don't take any offense if I come back and say, "Hey man, does this feature really need to be tolerance like this, or does it need to be shaped like this, or can I have, clearance here or something?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about it. Yeah, sure, it doesn't matter to
Yeah.
me." So, yeah, I totally agree. Brad JT asked, if you dedicated the next year to a passion project, what would you make?
That's a very good question, Brad. My goodness. Like a little peek behind the curtain, Dylan sends these questions to me beforehand, or to all his guests beforehand. And I've spent the last like 2 hours, or well, been more than 2 hours, trying to think of an answer to this. And it's a very challenging one, because my heart says that I'd love to spend a year to develop a watch that I want to wear. And it's not that I don't want to wear the watches that I've made up to this point. I love them all. It's just in the back of my mind, somewhere deep suppressed, I do have this like creative desire to create something that I want. And in a business setting, that's a very, very difficult thing to justify. When you've got an electricity bill, you can't go to your provider and say, "Well, I'm making something I want, and it's not bringing any money. Can you just give me a loan for the electricity?" It doesn't really work. So I
Well,
guess,
let's say somebody gave you $2 million
uh-huh.
today and said, make what you want to do. Would it be a watch?
Yeah, I think it would be.
Okay.
And a lot of that time would be spent on, you know, ideation and design, and not even like touching the milling machines for a long time. And I guess that's the one thing that is quite challenging to do, because it doesn't feel productive in a small company. If you spend time on design on a product, it's the best time you'll ever spend, both in terms of enjoyment, but in terms of product quality, in terms of like your brand identity. But it's the hardest thing to justify, because every hour you spend in front of SolidWorks or Photoshop or whatever is it just feels like a waste. It's not bringing in any direct money. So if someone alleviated that, and I could just spend a whole year doing whatever, a passion project, it'd be figuring out this sort of slightly more ethereal watch in the back of my mind and putting it to paper.
Well, so let me ask this. We had another question from David Eisnogel, who said, "What's your favorite non-Hacko watch to work on and favorite non-Hacko watch design?" And I'll kind of jump off that as well and say, in general, what are the things that you like in watches? Like, what would your watch look like? Where are you stealing the face from, or the face design, or the
Mm-hmm.
buckle, or any of these things? What do you like in watches?
That's a very good question. Uh, well, I guess I'll start with David's first question. I don't necessarily work on watches anymore. On the repair side of the business, we have like a team for that, and that's where you get a lot of exposure to different brands. As you know, any watch comes onto your desk, and you're tasked with repairing it. So I did that for a little while, for about 2 years, and that exposed me to many, many watches, but within one subset. So all those watches were like in a bracket of the consumer sort of the popular consumer picks, that meant that they were all roughly the same. They all had roughly the same configurations, and maybe some complications were different. But I was also working on very, very non-complicated watches, and that it actually it shaped my taste in the sense that I saw what I didn't like. It didn't really give me an insight into what I liked, but at least I knew that I didn't want some things in one day. This passion project watch, and that did spark something in the sense that I started looking elsewhere for inspiration. I started looking through catalogs and through sort of the concept car version of watches as well. So how Mercedes will release like a concept car. It's an architecturally sketched thing, and what actually turns up at the show is completely different. But this design study is shown to the world, and those were always so interesting to me because it was a pure design effort, and the designer was pushing the boundaries and trying to communicate something that they wanted with no limitation. And like that was something that Brad himself even said to me in designing like the Mark II, and he said design without limitation. And that's a very difficult thing to do when you're so mechanically minded. But I'm rambling, so I'll take a step back. I really like when a watch is not just a time-telling instrument. I really like it when a watch is a piece of art, and more than that, a sculpture on your wrist. And having an integrated design philosophy that has elements of, like, I guess, the function, but a focus almost totally on the form. That's very interesting to me. So some examples are like the Cartier Crash. It's a watch that Cartier made, and it, on first glance, it doesn't look very much like a watch. It looks like someone's put a watch in a hydraulic press, and hence the name Crash. But to me, that showed, and that was like sort of a very early watch in Cartier's catalog as well. So it showed design intent and design, I guess, exploration. Because at the same time, sorry, Dylan.
I was going to say it's very much like a Dali painting of a watch.
Yes.
His melting or clocks. Like I've never seen that. That's very cool.
Yes, yeah, it's a fantastic watch, and at the same time they were doing this very exploratory design. They were making standard, normal watches that appealed to a very large portion of their customer base. And another example of that in sort of more modern times, in the independent watchmaking sphere, is a company like Uhrwerk. And they're, Swiss-based company that make, in my opinion, sculptures for the wrist. They're time-telling instruments, for sure. But from the inception to the execution, they had just design as their primary goal. And, I'd love to make something like an Uhrwerk watch, except influenced and inspired by different things. So I like vintage cameras. There's a lot of motifs and a lot of design cues that you see in sort of mid-70s Japanese vintage cameras that they borrowed from somewhere else, but they made mass popularized icons and design ideas that are a great source of inspiration to me. And I guess leading from that, like Swiss design is a very, very interesting thing in terms of like typography, in terms of color rendition, in terms of there's a great documentary called Helvetica that talks about typography and things like that inspire creativity in me. It's just the execution of them is the missing step. I'm taking all these things in, but I need that person to alleviate me from my worldly troubles. So.
Well, so let me ask you this. You guys have serviced both Swiss and Japanese watches.
Uh-huh.
What are the things that you like about both of their styles? Because, I told you I took like a little month or two rabbit hole down into taking some watches apart. And just in taking apart a Swiss and a Japanese watch, you can see how drastically different they have interpreted like the standard watch form.
Yeah, that's always been a like point of debate amongst watchmakers. Japanese watches uh, sort of initially were very cheap. They were extremely inexpensive, and there's elements of that that have either stayed in the watchmaker's mind or either in the execution of their watches. There's like hints at mass produced, but it doesn't take very much to dig like just below the surface level of a Swiss watch to realize that that they're in the exact same boat. Swiss watches, 99% of them are also heavily mass produced, and the quality, not that it suffers, because there is a quite stringent quality demand on all watches by like the fact that they have to perform mechanically. But in terms of things like finishing, in terms of how the movements are designed, and many movements in the mass-produced Swiss and Japanese watchmaking sphere are designed with specific manufacturing processes in mind. So the first level is like stamping. So we're just gonna bypass milling for production. We might mill for prototyping, but all these parts will be optimized for like you know 10 parts per minute stamping process or 100 parts per minute stamping processes. And the second area is like assembly. So you can very quickly tell if a watch has been designed for mass assembly or if it's just been designed by a watchmaker who's only making 10 pieces a year. And even though there's, we're not necessarily talking about geography here, some of those traits leak into the geographical design mentalities of the watchmaking industry. So it's only been very recent that Japanese watchmakers like Citizen and Seiko have pushed the envelope to see where the high end part of their market is, and they've developed watches like the Grand Seiko, for example, or the Creedor range of watches that are really like just in the league of their own, and almost not even comparable to some of the Swiss watches in the same price point. So like $100,000+ watches, and those design cues and like mentalities, more than design cues, but mentalities around watchmaking are evident there, and they're sort of trickling down into their normal standard ranges. And now, that's all very like movement focused. One thing I will say about Japanese watches, especially Seiko, like they're sort of the hallmark of Japanese watchmaking, the execution of their hands and dials, like the thing that you're really looking at the most, is possibly the best on a mass-produced level that I've ever seen. They they take a lot of pride and a lot of care in how well they do that specific part of the watch, and that's not seen as much in the rest of the Swiss watchmaking industry, or it's not to that standard. So if you look at something like Grand Seiko, you'd be hard pressed to find a watch style that's finished to that standard anywhere else in the world. So yeah, those are my basic thoughts about, I guess, the comparisons between Swiss and Japanese watches.
That's great. Yeah, no, the Grand Seikos really interest me, especially like on a mechanical side. And I don't know how, you or like a true watchmaker feels, but like their spring drive movement is like the most exciting thing to me of any watch movement out there. It just like it, the second I saw it and kind of read into it, I was like, oh, this is genius. Like the whole
Yes.
integration of it. Cause you know, I understand why quartz movements are out there, but they kind of lose all of that fun of a mechanical watch. And so like the fact that you get a little bit of both with a spring drive, it was just so cool to me to see.
Yeah, departure from anything classical is going to be met with resistance. But the spring drive, I think, yeah, you're right, is like this little happy medium between the two, like the benefits you'd get from a higher end, it's not a higher end approach, but like a more sophisticated mechanical approach to a watch or timekeeping in general, and then the sort of the classic purist approach to watchmaking as well. People hate it as well, but man, those are the same guys that like think vinyl are, if you're listening to a CD, you're ruining your ears. So
Right. Yeah. I imagine it's hard to work in a sector like that is both, it's like this crazy dichotomy of like, you've got giant Swiss manufacturers using Kerns to make their watches, but like, departure, like we had talked when I first started taking apart watches, I was like, why the hell are they still using flatheads? This drives me nuts. It's impossible to pull these screws out. And like, it's just kind of part of the ethos and part of like, it is what it is because that's how it's always been, kind of mentality, which was really interesting to see. Well, your co-host, and I would be remiss if I did not nudge you both that you need to release a new episode. I went back and looked and I was like, it's been way too long. We need another one.
It has been.
But Adam asked, seeing that you had such stunning results and you were speaking kind of as watch as sculpture, and your newest watch really is gorgeous. The guilloche that you guys have is amazing. And so he says, seeing the stunning results that you're getting with your single point ruling on your Kern shaper, why have you made the investment in a manual guilloche machine? And then, are you also open up to job shop guilloche work? He has a 6-inch machinist scale that he would love to fancy up.
Yes, thank you, Adam. That's a very good question. Actually, thank you, Dylan, for the kind words about the Mark II. That's very kind of you to say. But I don't know, Adam's a bit of a troll when it comes to this sort of thing. He'll do anything for a laugh, and for in that sort of spirit, yes, I'll take on your scale project. I'll even do it pro bono to show you how much I appreciate you, Adam. It just won't be very good.
So is that what the machine you showing up the other day is? A manual guilloche machine?
Yes,
okay, so let's go into why that. Is it just too slow on the Kern, or can you make better patterns on the manual machine? Where did that all come from?
Okay, I'm going to ruffle feathers with this, but from an objective standpoint, doing it on a machine like a Kern is objectively better in every single way. It's a better result. It stands to a higher test under higher magnification. It's cleaner. It's faster. It's more productive. Everything's better. Nothing's worse, except the fact that it is it's done on a CNC machine, and I love that. I love that because it allows us to experiment and play and iterate really quickly, and also cut difficult materials. Doing titanium in a manual method is a challenge. It's undeniably a very, very large challenge. But on a machine like the Kern, it's less of a challenge. Still a challenge, but less of. So the purchase of this new, well, actually not new at all. It's a very old machine. It's about 100 years old.
Oh wow!
Yeah, it's from what I understand. This is what I've been told. It was made between the wars, between First and Second World War. The reason why we purchased it was not a need at all. It was very much a want purchase, and this was the only one in Australia. And a watchmaker friend of mine had imported it from Germany a few years back, and he was selling. And I said, well, this is the sort of thing that you have to just jump on. Wasn't part of any plan or any strategy. It was a machine that sort of came up, totally unique in our geography, but also within the world. There are not many of them. I mentioned Josh in the last podcast, Josh Shapiro, but he's a huge proponent of this type of machine and a very skilled craftsman when it comes to engine turning or guilloche work. And many of my watchmaker friends in the US, they also do this. Like Darren Tiffany, he's slightly more focused on Rose engines, but the same sort of manual approach to guilloche has rubbed off a little bit on me. And then Brad, who we heard from just a moment ago, he also does straight line engine turning. So Part of it was FOMO as well. It's like I want to be part of, I want to be part of this. But more seriously, I guess it was an investment into the future. Like we'll do one-off dials on this machine, or maybe small series that that we can leverage. Not necessarily slightly more interesting patterns, but the patterns will be handmade, and that will be a point of differentiation. Now, I don't want to say it's better or worse. In my opinion, I still think that something made on a Kern is technically better. But when you involve this like ethereal element of the soul of a product, things get a bit, bit strange. Like quality, it might actually be better that it's worse because it shows that it's handmade.
Right. Yeah, it has imperfections. It's not the same
Yes.
as every other one. I gotcha.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, personally, the guilloche you guys just did on the Current, I think, is one of the most beautiful dials I've ever seen. And especially, so you had talked about multiple processes, and I loved the pad printing that you guys did on the dial as well. I mean, it's very subtle, but it's such a good contrast to the blue that it really, really stands out, and it's great.
Thank you. The pad printing was challenging. That was, of all the things in the Mark II, it was the thing that we knew the least about, and it was the first time we'd done. And pad printing, I tell you what, it's a black art. Like, you talk about like the humidity in the room changing your measurements. Literally, like a couple of percentage point difference in humidity changes the way the ink dries. And like in pad printing, it's all about how the ink is drying. That's the I guess the vehicle of transfer between the pad and the dial is the evaporation of the solvents. So how the solvents are evaporating, the concentration of your solvents in the ink, you always have to be testing and topping it up. And, that's fine if you're doing like 1 or 2 dials, but we had to do 50. And within a day, you sort of like, even less, within an hour, you see a degradation of quality. And so you have to sort of reset up and remix your inks and then start again. And then you have to find this plateau and ride the plateau as long as you can. In an industrial approach, this is solved by like facilities that are dedicated to pad printing. But obviously we didn't have that. But you're right. The result was something that we really wanted to hark into in terms of contrast. You had like sandblasted finishes, ground finishes, the guilloche, but the pad printing, in my opinion, just linked a couple of these motifs together.
I had no idea that it was that hard to do. That sounds like it could be an absolute nightmare.
Yeah.
Let's see. M Rose watchmaking. We were just talking about surface finishing, so this is perfect. He said, "Ask about the surface finishing process related to watch components specifically, and other work that you do." He understands that you've got some cool equipment for it. So, what support equipment do you guys have for surface finishing in general?
Well, for internal components, many of the components are finished by hand. So that sort of looks like using micromotors, so like an NSK handpiece or something similar with either small grinding wheels or polishing felts, little bobs, and depending on the sort of result you want to get, you're either polishing or creating like a satin brushed finish. Many of those internal components also get like lapped, so there's quite a bit of lapping involved. And then you'd have like quasi lapping, which is not necessarily doing it with a slurry on a lap, but using diamond papers that you put on flat surfaces like glass or a piece of granite. And that gets you, some part of the way there as well. Then we use a lot of sandblasting or media blasting. And that helps get, very consistent, very even finishes. And then the process that is probably the most interesting, but we haven't really explored much, is like what I guess the technical description would be like planetary lapping or planetary tumbling with lapping media. And we have a machine that we bought from a company called Forplan, and they're based in Switzerland, and they make machines specifically designed to like tumble, except you're tumbling parts that are, like an M1 screw or like a pin that's 0.5 millimeters in diameter. And the result is not like a stone washed finish, but the result that they're aiming for, these these companies are aiming for that use these machines is a mirror finish. They just want the parts to be like glossy and perfect and deburred and just nice. And the way you achieve that is by like a planetary motion of some jars that are rotating and rotating in amongst their rotation. And you add copper media with like a diamantine, which is like a very fine aluminium oxide. And the aluminium oxide embeds in the copper, and it acts like a lap. So you're not necessarily like using a plastic media or a corncob media. I guess corncob would be quite similar in that sense that it embeds. But you have this like electromechanical, or at least chemical mechanical, not electromechanical, but chemical mechanical finishing process that's also acting on the parts. So that's something we want to get into, but it's driven by volume. So we're almost there. If we were to make 50 more watches that needed 20 screws each, suddenly your bill of materials, and you have to make spare parts, and you have rejects. So you might make like 2,000, 3,000 screws, and finishing them all by hand is a big challenge. So you'd have to leverage technologies like that. But I guess what I'm most proud of as well in terms of surface finishing is utilizing the CNC machines that we have to create interesting and dynamic patterns. And part of that is like the shaping, the straight line ruling that we do. But I've got some other ideas that haven't yet, publicly shown or spoken about that could, depending on how they're executed, I guess, but could generate some really, really interesting results too. And for me, it's an excuse to get a diamond lathe one day as well.
Well, I think that you have to get one now. Yeah. Well, so you were talking about small parts. Paul Alfaro asked, how many parts have been lost due to their size? Because you make some tiny stuff, especially. I always forget that you have the wire and the Swiss lathe as well, in addition to the Kerns.
Yeah, we've made some very small parts. There's one part on the website, on our NH Micro website. It's like a little flow restrictor. It's a little square with 4 holes in it, and I think it's like 0.4 millimeters cubed. And there's 4 holes that run through it. That I think the holes are 0.1 or 0.2. Can't quite remember, but anyway, a part like that is extremely challenging to handle. And I guess the rule of thumb there is that if it leaves your hand for whatever reason, like you drop it or you mishandle it, it's scrap. Like there's no chance that you can pick it up, find it, verify that it's still okay. Even getting it dropped or getting some contamination in it just ruins the need, not the need, but ruins its ability to be verified, tracked. And on the Citizen, that's not such a big deal because, your cycle time might be a minute or 2 minutes and you just run another one. But on a part that's made on the milling machine that, you might have some like 20 minutes of 3D milling with like a 0.1 ball and, you're just chipping away at something and you drop it, that sucks. That sucks a lot.
Yeah, it sure does.
Yeah. And in the sense of like material wastage, it's not bad, but in time, just absolutely terrible. So we've lost a lot of parts. It's part of the game, and you just try to. Well, actually, it's an interesting point. You factor that in to the whole planning of the job, and it might go so far to influence the way you approach even making it. If you have a really high consumable cost on a part that can be easily scrapped, you might consider a different method of manufacturing. So, leveraging the wire EDM to cut a hard material with a very small tool, instead of using a very small tool, rather, is a very wise decision. If you're worried that you're going to scrap the part or drop the part and so on, because the consumable cost in the wire EDM is very low. And similarly, you might move a part to something like the Citizen machine, even though the setup is 5 times longer and more finicky. But once it's set up, you can run 10 parts very, very easily compared to sort of doing the same process that might be a bit more user friendly on a milling machine, but you're tying up a lot of time per part. So yeah, those are my comments, I guess, on that.
Are there any like bins you found that or techniques you found to kind of handle small parts and make sure that you're not dropping them? I imagine that every time you drop one, you probably come up with a new rule or something. So, well,
Yes.
what lessons learned can you share with us?
Well, we use like paper towels a lot in the shop, and also neat cutting oil. And so when you have like a wet paper towel or like an oily paper towel, it attracts a lot of stuff to it, and like it's fibrous enough that the parts get sort of no, it's not quite static, but they get clung to it, and that can be a really good part catcher if you're making extremely small parts. Having something like that, it catches all the fines, but you can sieve those out as well. So that's one method that helps a lot in terms of part catching. Second is very, very fine sieves. So on the Citizen, we've got a couple of sieves that they're available on Masumi. They have like very high, very, very high. What's that term? It's like mesh openness or something like that, or
Yeah, I'm trying to think.
open area.
The second you started saying it, it like kind of went out of my brain. But I'm sure I'll think of it again.
Well, yeah, I'm sure the listeners also know what I'm talking about. But very small holes, and the wires that create the holes are quite large. So lots of oil drains through, but you can catch very small parts as well. And so those work great. And in terms of part storage, I think yes, you do lose parts during manufacturing, but you don't lose too many compared to like a mislabeled or poorly stored whole day's worth of parts. And there's been many times where you like make screws, for example, and you put them in a bin, and then that bin just exists somewhere with very little documentation about it. And you go to use the screws, and you have no idea what the screws are, and you just have to sort of either like, have they been hardened, have they been, polished, have they been sandblasted, deburred, and not having that certainty scraps a lot of parts really quickly. So there are some containers, like physical containers, from a company called Renfer, Renfer. They're based in Switzerland, and they do packaging specifically for the watchmaking industry. And the containers they have, my goodness, like I could spend thousands of dollars just in containers. It's terrible.
Oof,
But they're very,
that's
very high quality. And so, you have like little individual bins that could be, I don't know, like 1 millimeter by 3 millimeters by like 2 millimeters high. And so like a screw just perfectly fits into that little container. And so when it comes
oh
time,
wow.
yeah, and like individually bin screws, amazing. So they're not bumping up against each other and all the rest. And so when it comes time to assemble, you just have this one bin with like it might be like 500 parts, or maybe not five, like 200 parts per container, but they're all perfectly stored. And then you can label print some stuff on it to describe where in the process it is, or attach a small follower to it. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So, speaking of your Swiss and your wire, how has it been implementing those into NH Micro? Like, what have you learned kind of bringing those out of your own products and then into customer products?
It's a good question. I can start on the Swiss. So we're not a Swiss shop. I guess we have that machine, that R04, for our product, and we fudge our way through a lot of the components there. That machine doesn't get used very much as well. It might get used once every 2 months or so, and it'll make it do a job that's perfectly suited for it, and then it'll just stay off for a long period of time. Or when we're doing watchmaking work, we might use it for a week constantly, making all sorts of different parts. You just get it set up for screws, and you make all your different screws, and it stays off for a long period of time. So our competence level is not very high. Like it's difficult to make money on an hourly rate and be competitive when you have that machine available, but you're not efficient at using it. And that's, I guess, like quite an honest take. Like, we're not very good at that part of our workshop. But what it does offer is a lot of flexibility in terms of bidding on something like an entire assembly, that has some weird and wacky dowel pins. And so, yes, you do have to, spend your time and set the machine up for these weird and wacky dowel pins, but no one else in Australia might be able to make those dowel pins. And, or at least if they can make those dowel pins, they can't make the rest of the assembly. So it gives you an edge in quoting on jobs that require disciplinary approaches to manufacturing. And the same could be said with the wire EDM. I would say that compared to our competence level on the R04, we're far better at the wire EDM. We use it almost all the time. It's always doing something. And but in the same vein, we might have a job that has like one wire EDM feature, and 99% of the features are done in the milling machine. And because we have both, we can quote very competitively, and we don't have to outsource that work. Whereas some people, and I hate talking about competition with NH Micro. The Australian landscape is definitely big enough for like 10 more companies like this to exist. So it's not that we're undercutting or trying to get the last, like, race to the bottom. It's just that the vendor can go to one person and get everything they need. And I love Adam loves this phrase. It's like a black box. The RFQ goes into the black box, and then a part comes out, and the customer doesn't know anything that happens in between. And that's perfect,
Yeah. Well, and I imagine even if you're not the cheapest, just being able to turn around a quote that much quicker. I mean, It seems like, at least in the prototype side of the business, for me, getting a quote there first means far more than being the cheapest.
Oh, yes.
So I'm sure just, not having to wait for somebody to return your RFQ for wire work or something makes it incredibly easy for you.
Absolutely. And I see that with some of the turned components we need done outside of our shop. Like, we can manually turn maybe one or two prototypes. Sorry. And beyond that, we have to go elsewhere for turned components that we might like finish machine. And having a vendor that's reliable and stable is so good. Like, they'll return my quote within, I don't know, like 2 hours, 3 hours. It's amazing. But I could see that if that wasn't there, I'd be losing out on jobs that like further upstream that need that quoting. And do you, I guess that's my question is, do you find that expanding your capability like that is something that will grow your business more than just the capability that you're given, but rather the opportunities that you'd be able to access?
I'd argue you either have to expand your capabilities or expand your network. And like, that's what we've done, is expand our network. Like, I just make sure, not very often, but like if I come across a job where like maybe it's not the most profitable, but I know that it's going to push us into an area that will develop a good vendor, I will very often take that work just to develop that vendor and develop that relationship, because then, then it's a no-brainer. Like, oh, I need lathe work. Cool. I know this person.
Yes.
I know they're going to return my call. I know they do good work. I'm on it. Anodize. I've got a great anodizer. Now I know their price list. I don't have to go to them for quote, kind of thing. And like, it's those kind of things that I think, if you're not going to bring it in-house, you've got to develop those relationships. Kyle Brunner asked, what's the most functional option on the Kern for you?
That's a good question as well. I wouldn't say it's necessarily like an option, but yeah, I guess more a function is the spindle Z-axis or spindle/Z-axis compensation that happens in real time. So, I mean, I'm going to use the words of Marvin here. A spindle is just a fancy heater. That's all it is. It turns a tool, but it generates a lot of heat as well in the process. And you have like active cooling to keep the temperature down. But our micro HD spindle at full bore is like 31 degrees or 32 degrees, and at resting it's 20.0. So a 10-degree shift in, that's, I guess, the front bearing temperature. And maybe the motor could be even higher. It could be like 50 degrees or 55 degrees at full bore.
Right. Which is a ton of heat.
Yeah, it's a ton of heat. It's dumping it wherever it wants to go. And I guess that is the biggest difference between expensive machines and like really expensive machines, is what they do with that. Like, how the hell do you approach that problem? Active cooling is is limited in its ability to handle where that heat goes. You need it. It's not a negotiable item. But which next step do you take to manage that thermal, I guess, influence? And what Kern does, which is, it makes working on the HD just an absolute dream, is that they've mapped out what happens to the z-axis as that spindle increases in temperature between different RPM, and how quickly it does it and all the rest. They've got all these data points that map out the growth of the z-axis. And this is particularly relevant to the micro HD or the micro platform because it's an aluminium-based machine. So aluminium grows even more. And the end result of all this data wrangling is that they have a software-based model that describes the z-axis growth in real time, and they compensate for that in real time. So if you have a cold machine and 0 RPM, and you have a tool, 0.5 millimeter tool, and it's going to be spinning at 30,000 RPM, that z-axis grows by like 50 microns, or it moves and shifts by 50 microns. But the linear motors are dragging that whole z-axis up, so the tip of the tool is actually not moving more than a micron. And prototyping or doing job shop work becomes such a breeze because you don't have to wait for the spindle to warm up. You can just start cutting. You might have 10 seconds. The first, not even 10 seconds of the tool warming up is all sorts of stuff is happening. Those bearings are getting whipped around, and like the heat and the grease and the air oil, it's just chaos. But after 10 seconds, it's great. Whereas on the Pyramid Nano, if I'm cutting with a 0.5 millimeter tool and I really care about my Z height, I might wait 10 minutes, 15 minutes before I start cutting. And that, I'll wait that time, then measure the tool, and then start cutting. And the same thing is that once you finish cutting, you have this drop off. And so if you load your next tool straight away and you start cutting, you're going to get interesting results as that spindle is like cooling down and so on. And the only thing that it doesn't take into account is your tool holder growth. So, if you've got an 80 millimeter long tool and it's steel is like 11 microns per meter per degree. So it's 1 micron per 100 millimeters per degree. I think I'm doing this right. So yeah,
that sounds right.
You get some growth for every degree that gets dumped into your holder. And so we did some I'd say quite advanced microfluidic molds where you're hard cutting with small tools, and that matters a lot because they care an incredible amount about the step heights between tools. And so if you have like a 1 micron or 2 micron step between two different tools that are facing the same flat surface, it's a rejected part. They need that blend to be bang on. And even with that approach, you still let the machine warm up and the tool holder grow, but you don't care about what the machine's doing. It's like that black box again. All this stuff's happening in the background. You just press start. And it's not something I got with the Pyramid Nano because it's so much more involved. But it's a 15-year-old machine. That technology just wasn't there.
That's great. Yeah, talk about a killer function. Like I know, and I'm sure on the Pyramid Nano you see it if you have a longer runtime too, because I've seen that like on machines where you're used to a 15-minute cycle and all of a sudden you have like an hour and a half cycle and you're like, oh, my tool is fine on one side of the part and gouging on the other side of the part. And you're like, oh, great. Okay, I got to rerun the entire finish pass now.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
It can be a nightmare. All right, so Cyrus Lloyd and Oshin Leahy both were asking about your engineering background, and so Cyrus Lloyd asked, as someone with an engineering background, what part of that education, if any, do you find helped you the most in your machining journey? And then Oshin Leahy was kind of asking about what are things that you can get away with in one field and not in the other, so like going back to your workflow and just the way you think about all these things.
Cyrus, I'm not an engineer, and I'm like saying that I've got an engineering background is very flattering, but I dropped out of engineering school. I was 3 years into a 4-year degree. And
I will say, I think I edited that. He had, as someone with most of an engineering background, and I just shortened it. So he beat you into that.
Good. I need to know my place. Yeah, there are elements of that engineering education that I still use, like statics and dynamics are great sort of base level things to have an understanding of, and what like what's a moment doing, and the force as it's being pushed this way. What is it bending, and like I guess Robin Renzetti calls this mental FEA, which is it's not a bad way of describing it, but that that was not something I necessarily had before engineering, and I did have after, so I can attribute it to the education. But beyond that, man, my goodness, they don't teach you very much at engineering school, and I think most engineers will say that they learn on the job in the first like 5 years after they graduate. That's when they pick up all the little tips and tricks, and that's not saying anything negatively towards engineering education. It's just that engineering is far more than the 4 years that you're exposed to. And often engineers get hired in fairly specific fields where there's tribal knowledge or at least extended knowledge to be gained. And manufacturing is just one of those fields. It's so deep. It's so broad in its rabbit holes and warrens and so on. So it's very difficult to pull stuff from the engineering education. And maybe they just taught all of that in the 4th year and I just missed out. I don't know. But in the first
Well,
three, I didn't.
I think a lot of it, though, is what you're alluding to, is that they teach you how to think
Yeah.
about mechanical systems or whatever. Because it is, as specialized as mechanical engineering is, it is also super general, like you said, when it comes to finding a job. It's like, yeah, you're a mechanical engineer, but now you're just doing just this, like just this
Yes.
very tiny subset. So yeah, I think that a lot of it, and I've been told that too by job recruiters and stuff, that like, well, we just wanted to make
Mm.
sure that you knew how to think, and like we can train you how we want you to think from here on, but as long as you like have done that work, then we're happy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So then, yeah, Oshin was also asking, what similarities and differences do you have between the watch side and the high precision side, and what things can you get away with in one that you can't get away with in the other?
I guess one thing is sort of what I mentioned earlier, that making your own product affords you lots of shortcuts when both in prototyping but also in final production in terms of your QC processes. So you don't have to necessarily go to the nth degree when you have your just internal requirements that you have to meet. And that's something that I guess we did sort of allude to in terms of the consultancy, and sort of bringing that mentality into some of these parts that we're making for other people. But I guess,
Well, let me let me
sorry.
rephrase the question then. Is
Mm.
there anything that you did in watchmaking that
Mm-hmm.
you find that you don't have to do when you're doing aerospace or high end stuff that you were surprised that we're not all doing?
Yeah, I guess like aiming for higher surface finishes. That's one thing in watchmaking that's always on your mind. It has to be an aesthetically pretty part. But the first couple of NH micro jobs we did, you ask them, it's like, oh, do you want this sandblasted or not sandblasted? Or do you like, what surface finish do you want on this feature? They don't care. They just want it to be within spec, and that spec, they might not even know what the spec is. And aesthetic things like, oh, where do you want the engraving done? Like, that's something I care about in watchmaking, and you have to care about in watchmaking. But often clients don't really mind at all. And in terms of, I guess, in terms of like workflow, um, because we have access to the entire assembly of the product, we can reference the assembly and figure things out on the fly. And this is not really a watchmaking specific thing; it's more like a product specific thing. But when you're working with just one component in an assembly, or even an assembly within a subassembly, or a subassembly within assembly rather, you don't get that opportunity of that instant feedback. And that's something I miss, I guess, because it's always interesting to know what you're making.
Yeah.
And the more you know, it's more passionate you can be, and generally the high quality the product is. So because we're invested in our own product and we know what it's going to, or even who it's going to, which is also fascinating. Like which client has bought this. That's a fascinating like motivator.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's the quality I think goes up in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I always very much appreciate it when my customer like shares assembly pictures or anything like that with me,
Yes.
because very often like I don't even get a part name. I'll just get a number. And like I'll
Yeah.
have people ask me like, "Oh, well, what do you make at your shop?" And I'm like, "Metal parts, plastic parts, this stuff." I don't know, like and like I think people when I say stuff like that, they think I'm joking, and it's like that's as much information as I have. You now know everything I know about what I just made.
Yes.
It's like it's got threads and it's got some features and that's it. Yeah. So
It's like why do we even need an NDA? Like I don't know
right.
anything about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you worried I'm going to share your box with other people? Like, do you think this is proprietary? Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes you're like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever.
Yes.
Oh boy. Well, that brings us on to shop news and new things. So you mentioned the guilloche machine. Are there
Mhm.
any other workflows you're experimenting with, tools you're experimenting with, new machinery, new anything?
Um, well, it's not quite recent per se. Like it hasn't happened in the last week, but in the last like maybe 2 or 3 months, um, I've been really enjoying using some tools from NS Tool. They're it's like the MHRH range. Um, they're sort of mold and die cutters that are like got a relieved shank and just some little tiny itty bitty amount of flute at the very tip of the tool, and you can get some crazy long reaches, and they cut incredibly well. Like there's tools that you think that would never cut well, and they cut well in like all sorts of different materials too. So there was a couple of parts that we were making recently that use those tools. Um, they're made from aluminium, and I was sort of harvesting that knowledge from, we needed some very, very straight walls and no taper in the wall, so we couldn't use like a big end mill and use the total side of the flute. You had to ramp down slowly with a smaller cutter. And the results that we got in aluminium, which is a very easy material to cut, but these cutters are designed for hard steels, were just amazing. And it's not necessarily opened my mind, but it's definitely hinted at like why wasn't I doing this before? I was having great results in hard steels, and then I'd struggle in aluminium because I'd use completely different strategies. Because for some reason I just didn't click in my mind. Well, why didn't I just do the same thing? Maybe the cutter's not going to perform to the best spec, but the results definitely good enough. So there was that, and I guess the guilloche machine is very exciting. So as soon as I have some more time, it got shipped in a very disassembled state, so it's a bit of a Lego kit, which I'm
Oh
actually
boy.
quite. I'm looking forward to it because
Oh,
there's
good.
no electronics.
Right.
So,
Well, and I guess you don't need it. It's not
no.
something that needs to be set up and running
Yes.
tomorrow.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
okay. How is the sourcing of NS tools? Because I know, I think a lot of us in the US kind of are spoiled
Uh huh.
very, by MSC and Next Day Air and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And like sourcing tools can be pretty difficult for you guys. So, do you have a local distributor that stocks, or is there somewhat nearby stock that you can get pretty quickly?
So yeah, there's a very good local distributor. They're called Live Tools, and they represent NS in Australia. Um, I should also say that Union Tool make the exact same lineup and range. In fact, I wouldn't. It'd be very difficult for me to find any big differences between them. They're both incredibly high quality tools. And Union Tool is also starting to get stocked in Australia as well. Um, and there is a lead time hit in both of those tools. NS Tool is about a week through Live Tools, and then Union Tool is actually supplied through ISCAR, which is very interesting. But they
Interesting.
are about a week as well, maybe a bit more than a week, which is a challenge. In the prototype sort of job shop world, everything's about your lead time, and it's forced us to be quite creative in like how many tools we keep on hand. So we're slowly building up a bigger and bigger library so that we can approach these jobs much more quickly. But also in terms of like if I get a RFQ for a job and it's got custom tooling, I'll tell the engineer straight away. I'll be like, hey, you got some custom tooling here. If you want me to meet a certain lead time, let's get onto the custom tooling first. Cut me a PO for that. It's not going to be much, maybe like 500, $600 or whatever it is. And then if you don't like want to go down that road, you're only out 500, $600, but we're guaranteeing some, almost mythical lead time for you by starting this process a lot earlier. Because it might take them a week to decide. In a large corporation, the engineer is like going, yes, 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 let's do it. But the purchasing department's dragging their feet. And
Right.
so
they're like, oh, well, we have to send out bids to 3 people and we have to wait forever. Yeah. I know that feeling for sure.
Exactly. So that's
that's smart. That's a really smart way to deal with that. I've never thought about just, saying, well, let's get your tools ordered and then we can go from there. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. What about you? What's new?
We are actively looking for a new shop space. I went and saw one last week that I was kind of hoping would be the one, but it was more space than we needed and more money than we really wanted to pay. And then we were like, oh, well, we can get over that if the landlord's willing to work with us. And we get there and they're like, oh no, you need to sign a 3-year minimum lease and we're not willing to do anything for you. We're not willing to help you build it out. You're on your own. I was like, okay, that told me everything I needed to know. So we're actively looking. There might be a place that opened up. It sounds like the landlord's a little concerned about the noise, and so we're kind of trying to go back and forth and see what we can do about that. But yeah, we're actively looking. We need more space. We're tired of being cramped in 1,000 square feet. So,
and is that easy to do in your area? Are there industrial parks and regions?
There are there are more industrial parks on the side of town that Brad and I don't live by, and so we were trying to get them closer to where we both live. If I wanted a 45-minute or an hour commute, I think it'd be very easy to get a shop space on the other side of town. But that was the reason we looked at this bigger place, was that it was like one street over from our current shop. We're like, oh, cool. The move will be super easy. This will be great. And so we're trying to stay, within a couple exits on the highway of where our current shop is, just to make the move a little easier. And it would basically maintain both of our commutes. So we'll see. But it's heavy in our mind. That's both of us are just feeling very cramped and like we can't. We've optimized the space as much as we can. There are shelves, we've built up vertically everywhere we possibly can and stored things like that, and still don't feel like there's enough storage or anything like that. So yeah, we're working towards it.
Yeah, brilliant. And in a new shop space, would that open up the possibility for new machines?
That's the plan. Yeah, we want to get enough room that we could bring in another machine, enough power that we could bring in another machine, all of that. I want, like, our shop space right now is warehouse and then a tiny office, and the tiny office is shipping and inspection and our little fridge with a microwave on top so we can eat, and it's everything that we don't want in the shop space. So it'll be nice to have an inspection room, and everywhere that we're looking we're not going to move anywhere that doesn't have AC or is willing to put in AC. We put in a mini split into our shop maybe a year and a half ago, and I mean, it was amazing, but it's still kind of not enough for 1,000 square. If we had tiny ceilings and stuff, it might work. Yeah. But we've got, I think, 15 or 17 foot ceilings, so it's asking a lot of a little mini split.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's been big on our mind, and then we've also been just working a lot on kind of more optimization of our workflows, templates, things like that. Standard tool holders, I think that's kind of my big push for this year. I have a standard build out for every machine, but they're in whatever holder we can dedicate to them.
Right.
And I think this year we're going to dedicate some time and money to probably just a power grip for every one of our standard tools, and a standard, I want a sheet that says it sticks out exactly this far from this holder, and I want every single machine to be the same. And then my idea is to have little 3D printed tags that say modified standard tool. And so you'll throw that on the machine if you had to pull it out longer or something for a specific job. But that way, Fusion, the toolpath simulation is correct, and I don't have to stress about it. I don't have to go verify anything. It is what it is, and it's correct. And so that's, I think, my bigger push for the beginning of this year.
And sorry if I keep asking questions. It's just fascinating. It's
No,
like a peek behind the curtain. You ask
I'm
so many
enjoying
questions to everyone else. And in terms of your work, do you find that in the prototype field, it's like a drought and then like rainstorm type flow, or do you have consistent workflow or work rather?
For the last maybe 6 or 8 months, it's been very consistent. Like generally in the last, I mean, this will be our 8th year technically in business. And for the last maybe 5 or 6, January and February has always been very slow for us, or January and then like the first week in February. And this year it was not at all that case. Like we
Wow.
came back from, it was the first time we took a week off for Christmas and New Year's. And then we came back from our break and had to hit the ground running. And like, it's been tough. There's been a few parts that we've done in the last week or so that have been they haven't been very tight, but the material's just been moving on us a lot. And we ended up scrapping a whole lot of peak, which is not cheap. And it's been a tough couple of weeks. And like, I think a lot of it is due to just pain in the ass parts, but a lot of it is also due to us not being mentally ready. Like we were like, oh, we'll take a week off and then we'll have 2 weeks to kind of get back in the swing of things and get some shop work done and get some shop projects organized and all of that.
Yeah.
And it was like, nope. Like I had customers texting me 3 days before I was back in the shop, like, hey, when can I send you work again? Or like, emails like, can you quote this? And I was like, I'm not even in the office yet. Like this is okay, sure. So, I don't want to come across like I'm complaining about work. I am super, super happy to be busy, but it was just very unexpected for us this year.
And would you say that the stability is a reflection on the state of manufacturing in America, or I guess globally? Or is it the state of how your business has developed and the networks and connections that you've harvested over those 8 years have gotten you to a point of stability? Or is it a mixture of both?
Probably a mixture of both. Like I'd love to just, pat myself on the back and be like, no, it's all our hard work. But I think a lot of it is really that there is just a lot of work going on right now. And I think there's a big drought of people to do it. Like last I heard, there's like 1 million empty jobs in the US in manufacturing or something like that. And not on top of that, I think that there's a lot of shops that have kind of decayed. Because they've ridden all these waves of economic downturns and upturns, they really have not stayed current on a lot of things to make themselves the best option. And so I think that we really try to deliver the best quality surface finish, to deliver on time every time, deliver the absolute best parts we can. And I know a lot of people say that too, but like I do think that if we're living in a time right now where it's very easy to distinguish yourself as a good shop, like there are so many people doing it so poorly that like just like emailing people back and they're like, oh man, you're a rock star because you got back to me today. And I'm like, I did the least amount of effort. And I'm happy, and I'm really happy that that's like what it takes. But I mean, at the other hand of that, I'm really sad that that's like where so many shops have put us.
Yeah, I tell you what, like we have lots of vendors that we buy stuff from, and from that perspective, it's very interesting to see what I value, and it is that it's like, how quickly can you get back to me with a quote or a formal quote, or like just even a lead time or something like that? Do you have it in stock? And when I'm on the other side, when I'm sending emails out, that's one of the things that's in my mind. But often I think of like, well, I need to get the quote as accurate as possible. I need to, wait for all these things. And sometimes people just want an email saying, yep, your email's being received. I'll get back to you in like 20 minutes. And that level of communication, I think, is difficult to find in manufacturing in general. Like I hate to say it, actually, I love to say it, but like all of our Swiss vendors suck. They suck so much and I think it's a mixture of a lot of things. I'm pretty sure it's a high level of Swiss corporate racism where they don't want to share their products externally. They love selling to Switzerland and having a big circular economy. It also makes sense. Like those Swiss clients, like way bigger for them. So devoting energy and time to like an English speaking Australian or American or, even a German is more effort than it's worth. But in general, like I have to wait like a week sometimes for a reply to an email. And then
That's crazy. And you would think like on a culture that prides themselves so
I
much
know.
on punctuality,
Yeah.
that is like such a departure from that.
Total departure. And it's not like I mean, it's hard to talk about this without sounding arrogant, but like, I'm sometimes these POs that I want to give them are like 5 figures, like mid 5 figures. It's like, hey,
Right. You're
let's
not like, can I give 2 parts? You're like, no,
yeah,
I need a lot of parts.
yeah. I want you to be a partner in a project, and it can take months and months just to get a formal quote, something with their letterhead on it, so I can give it to our accountant and be like, yeah, this is the direction we want to go. And knowing that and being able to like offer a client the complete inverse is sometimes very satisfying. And yeah, I don't know how we got onto that, but either way, yeah.
Well, no, so you were talking about accurate quotes, and I would say that is I think that's the biggest thing I took away from Critical Chain, was that you can't be more accurate than the noise in the process.
Yes.
And that's like really freed me up of like worrying about, it's like, no, I'm just going to do the best I can and make sure like that I, cover my ass a little bit, but like, I can't be better than that, because
No.
shit happens. Like,
Yeah.
that's just, it is what it is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's great. That brings me to the last question, Josh. What did you research this week?
Well, totally not machining related. I've been on a bit of a binge to find the best croissants in Sydney, or at least in the part of Sydney where I live. And it all got started because we have a coffee machine here at work, so we don't really go to cafes that much to get coffees in the morning. But I was buying some milk and some beans at the supermarket, and there was like a very small cafe that had opened up, and they were selling croissants. And I was like, feel peckish, buy one. Fantastic croissant. I was like, man, I thought we had crap croissants in Sydney. It was better than like a French one that I've had in Europe.
Really?
Yeah. And I said,
Wow.
well, maybe there's something to this. And the more I dug and like the little, the rabbit hole that I created, the more I realized there is like a burgeoning, bustling sort of artisan bakery community in Sydney. And everything from like ultra high quality bagels to all sorts of pastries, croissants, and all the other beautiful buttery pastries that they make. And that would have been fine, except what I realized after I was doing my research is that one of Sydney's best artisan bakeries, and like a wholesale bakery as well, they actually do it in the back and then they have a storefront, but also sell to all these cafes, is like one street away from where I live. And it's like in the middle of yeah, it's
that's
terrible.
Dangerous.
It's so bad. Very dangerous. But it's like in the middle of suburbia. No one would have guessed. And so I was like reading this article. I'm like, what? I live there. That's like one street away from me. And so one Sunday morning, I just got up really early and, went over. And then they do coffee as well. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get fat. And so that's what I've been researching. I've been trying to figure out like, well, if there's one of these, where are the others? And the industrial area that we're in currently, it's called Brookvale. In the last like 3 or 4 years, so many, and I don't drink alcohol, but like so many breweries have opened up, like microbreweries and artisan breweries, that they've brought along this sort of, I guess, niche food culture as well with them. And what I've realized in like the last 2-3 days is there's another bakery, another street away from me, but where I work, not where I live.
Oh,
and so
no.
it's gonna be terrible.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That is really, really great.
And what about you?
Awesome.
What have you researched?
So a lot of it has been real estate, finding not only places to look at and talk to, but, kind of diving into things that you should talk to real estate agents and landlords about when you're negotiating leases,
Right.
and, what like NNN means, like triple net. You're like, you start looking into all this stuff and you're like, I don't know any of this. Like what is going on? um yeah, that's been a lot of it. I can't really I don't think too much machining related. I've been doing a fair bit of 3D printing. I'm doing a
Hmm.
housing design for one of my customers, so having a reliable printer again, I can't speak more highly of that bamboo than I have. Like it's just been like such a game changer to actually be able to rapid prototype with it and not like worry about it.
Yes.
Like I think I did 4 or 5 revisions over the course of like a day and a half, and every time I would have a new idea or a new slight design change, I just print it again. And the connectors he sent models over, they all fit in the print, and I don't have
Oh,
to worry about tolerances. And it's just like, yep, this is what I wanted. This is exactly what I needed.
it's what was advertised, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it very much feels like the future I was promised as a teenager when 3D printing arrived on the scene. Like one day you'll have one of these in your house and you'll be able to print whatever you want and it'll just show up.
Yes.
And it's like, yeah, it actually does that now.
It only took like 10 years. Yeah.
Right, right,
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, not too much research at the shop besides that. Like we kind of know what holders we like now. There's not a lot
Hmm.
of research into that. I'm always looking into tooling and stuff. We've been using a lot more Freza end mills, and
Hmm.
we've been switching a lot of our threading over to Moldino thread mills,
Oh,
which are the
yeah.
ones that like the boring thread mills that Adam uses.
Yeah.
We just find that like I've got a 6 millimeter hydraulic holder, and those are all 6 millimeter shanks, and then I've got a couple 6 millimeter collets for the Rego. And so like if I see a thread that's a normal length of diameter, it's like, man, I'll just throw that in there. I've got a template infusion. I bring it in. I
Yes.
select the hole. Like I don't have to worry about it.
Yes.
I just gauge it once. I roughly know that they're going to take like almost no comp to dial in the thread in almost any material. So it just makes my life so much easier. I don't have to set up
Mm.
a drill and a tap. I don't have to worry about like, oh, did I drill far enough for the tap to get the depth that it needs. Very often we get drawings or models from engineers where they're like, oh yeah, I need thread right up to the bottom of this like shoulder at the it's like, so either I would have to create a custom tool, or lucky for you I have these special thread mills that like get within half a pitch of the bottom. It's like, okay, cool, yeah, I can do it, it's fine. So that's been like I said, I think a lot of it has just been standardized stuff, like make stuff so that
Mm.
Brad and I can just make parts, and it takes a lot of the BS work out of making
Mm.
prototypes.
Yeah, that's brilliant to
So
hear. Yeah.
yeah, I'll definitely update things, more. Oh, I guess that's the other thing I haven't been researching, but I've been scheming a little bit. So I bought that tradesman grinder to
Oh,
relieve and neck
yeah.
tools. I like it so far. It it's nothing. I wouldn't call it precision. Like the spindle is fine, and the spindle that holds the tool is fine as far as necking goes. But like the screws for X and Y are just
Right.
based on screw threads. They're not, ground ball screws or anything. So I wouldn't expect, like, they have a little dial that I think is supposed to represent thousandths on the I guess it would be X axis. And it's
Uh-huh.
like, no, you just, you go until you hear it touch, and then you go until you think it's right, and then you mic it. Like I'm not relying on this screw to tell me that it's a good thing. But for what it is, like, it's by far the cheapest way to get into necking and relieving end mills. And now I'm kind of building a cart for it.
Mm.
Because the other thing I didn't really like, they sell a vacuum table that it can sit on to kind of get all the dust away, but it's got to be 2 or 3 inches from where it's actually necking the tools. And I was like,
Mm.
I got a 3D printer, I've got machines, I can make something that I like a little better than this. So I bought a little Home Depot Husky cart, and I'm going to bolt it to the top. And then I bought a tiny little shop vac with a HEPA filter in it in the bottom. And I'm going to make a little custom dust filtration thing that when I turn on the unit, turns on the dust filtration, and then I can just, go to town.
Oh,
But
that's
yeah,
brilliant.
that's about it. I think for right now.
Well, we love hearing. I mean, I'm talking as an audience member now, but we love hearing what's happening in your shop.
I appreciate you. You are the second person within a week to say something like that. So I
Oh,
think I'm gonna
good.
have to figure out. I have been. Maybe we could all peer pressure Easton, Drew, and Jake, because I wanted them all to come back on and kind of do a year
Yes.
year in review. And maybe we can do that, or I'll find somebody else that come back on more frequently and give some more shop updates, because I would love to share that with everybody. It's not like I've been trying to be extra secretive. It's just, kind of the nature of interviewing people.
It would make for good listening, and it's a proven thing. It's what happened earlier in the life of the podcast as well. We heard about what was happening in your shop, so it's like it's almost like a friend's gone away, and every time you sort of hear a little bit of snippet of what's happening, it feels like home. So yeah, good to hear.
Well,
Very good to hear.
I'll make it happen for sure. Maybe Chris and I will kind of do a half and half book club and shop update kind of thing.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Yeah. Well, Josh, thank you so much for both waking up incredibly early, for me at least, or for you, and taking all the time to be on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I know you're a very busy guy.
No problem at all. And thank you for creating incredible content. And I'll do a pitch for you. If you're not on Dylan's Patreon and you're listening to this podcast, you're stealing from him. And you should, no. In a very serious note, the content you create is a blessing to the machinist community, and it's the thing I look forward to the most every week, hearing you and the interesting people that you interview. So thank you.
Oh, well, I really appreciate it. You that really means a lot. Yes, thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. Thanks to the patrons, and I will be back next week.